Welcome back to UNT's Mayborn Literary Nonfiction Conference. I'm Alana Rocha, Director of News Partnerships for the Texas Tribune and a longtime multimedia reporter before that. This is Mindful Stories, exploring mental health, checking in on the journalism and journalists having to cover the events of the past year and a half. It's still going. I am joined by Elvia Limon. She is a colleague of mine at the Texas Tribune as an engagement producer. Olivia Messer is a freelance journalist who is now based in Florida. And Alex Samuels is a former colleague of mine at the Texas Tribune, now reports on politics and race for 538. Welcome, ladies.
Thank you for having us.
Yeah, no, I think in preparing for this, it's kind of going to be a mini therapy session talking about how it's been for each of us and all of us collectively being journalists at this time, where it just was one huge news event after another. So we've been tapped mentally, physically, always on. If it wasn't the pandemic, it was the murder of George Floyd last summer, the winter storm. More recently, the legislation and law related to abortion access. So when we think of we had reached our limit, yet another devastating event that also affected us personally would be on our plates. So let me kind of start here. 18 months into this time, how do you feel as though it's changed your approach to journalism? Elvia, we'll start with you.
Sure. Well, I guess before, I mean, there were some events that I would write about or, be involved with projects that were somewhat related to my life, but not necessarily as much as the last couple of months have been. The pandemic affected a lot of people in my family. I have family members who have died from COVID-19. And I think it just kind of helped me be more empathetic with people. Not that I wasn't before, but it just kind of has helped me take a step back whenever these stories are happening and just kind of think about, like, how do I tell this in the most meaningful way? Of course, I write the brief for the Texas Tribune. So, like, how do I present this information so that people, it's in a respectful way, empathetic way, but also helpful for people who may be, skeptical of things that are happening. I know that happened in my family too, especially during the pandemic, with a lot of information happening, they just didn't know what to believe. And so that's one way that I approached it. Like, just thinking about misinformation, thinking about being empathetic to people who might be susceptible to it, and just being empathetic when it comes to telling their stories.
Mm-hmm. Alex, you cover race and politics. You did for us at the Tribune, and now you do that at the 538. How has it changed your approach to those topics that are never for a lack of headlines?
Yeah, so a lot has happened with the intersection of race and politics in the last 18 months, probably the biggest thing being the murder of George Floyd. I feel like kind of after that happened, there was this feeling amongst a lot of newsrooms like, oh, we need to treat race and politics not just as kind of this side issue that people kind of cover but not really cover, but no, this is something that needs to be at the forefront of conversations in all newsrooms. Now, I remember specifically my editor at the Tribune sent me to the public, I think it was the public wake for Floyd. And then the next day was his funeral. And I remember talking to my editor and just saying, I'm not going to go inside and look at this man's body. Like, it was just such a traumatic experience. People were walking out of that room in tears. And I was just like, maybe I'm missing a part of the story, maybe I'm not. But as a Black woman, I had to set those boundaries for myself for what I could and couldn't do as it relates to race and politics coverage. I think now, kind of going past that, what I've been really more interested in doing is, finding segments of the population who maybe aren't getting the news as easily because of where they're located or because of access to internet or access to resources that they have, kind of what Elvia was getting at there. But I do think there's a lot of misinformation about the COVID vaccine in the Black community and in other communities of color. So I see part of my job is trying to kind of sift through that misinformation and find the best way to explain these stories, and kind of basically tell readers, this is how other groups of people are looking at COVID. This is how other groups of people are looking at the vaccine. So I feel like a lot of political reporting these days is focused so heavily on, here's what lawmaker X is saying versus lawmaker Y, and, just kind of writing it that way. But I think what I found to be most important over the last couple of months is really just saying, okay, how are everyday people grappling with the same things that we are grappling with as journalists?
I'm going to pause real quick. Can you guys mute any notifications? I heard some, and I think it's fine, but I think I heard some sort of ding go off. Okay, thank you. Let me see. Olivia, you left the Daily Beast and went into the freelance world, in recent months. How has it covered your approach to journalism after, as your bio says, having epidemiologists and everybody else involved with the pandemic on speed dial?
I think what's interesting to me about the change is that I've done political reporting and I've done breaking news and I've done a wide variety of crime reporting. But for me, when I started COVID reporting and speaking to epidemiologists all the time and became aware that the answers to my questions would have a personal effect on how I felt. There was a point where I realized, okay, I'm living in New York City. This is the epicenter at the moment. When I ask what's going to happen to hospitals, how quickly are people going to be able to be treated? Are we ever going to be able to be tested? I was stuck in my apartment in Brooklyn wanting the answers to those questions to be good news. And for me, it reminded me that, all of this time that I'd been, reporting on policy that maybe didn't affect me personally, the real common thread brought me all the way back to the beginning of my career when I was writing about sexual harassment in the Texas legislature. You can't ask an intern or a staff member to talk about sexual harassment and not have them personally invested in what they're talking about and in the story you're writing. And remembering that it's really unusual to be writing a story where the person interviewing you and the person being interviewed and the reader are all personally invested in what you're saying and how you're saying it. It's been the most wild email experience as a reporter. People saying on both sides of the coin, you're trying to get schools to close because you don't care about education, to you're trying to send kids back to school because you want kids to die. I mean, people will just accuse you of everything under the sun. And I think, sort of as was touched on before, the idea of boundaries, both in terms of how you do your work and the amount of time you do it and the subjects that you're willing to cover, but also really taking time to recognize that there has to be a boundary between you and your readers, and the way that you think about the work that you're covering, because you can't be 100% emotionally invested in every answer to every question. It's too exhausting.
Well said. I mean, I was thinking of past events I've covered that have affected me personally after I once come down from, being in the midst. It's like we put a shield up when we're going in to cover something, and then it's only when we step away that we realize the magnitude of what we just covered. But as I listed at the top, just the list of huge events, as I thought, the pandemic, George Floyd, the election, and then we had the winter storm, and then like I said, abortion access. It just seems like after all of this, how do you talk about those boundaries and that self-care that we've had to look out for ourselves? I believe that we've had good newsrooms, at least intentions in trying to say take care of yourself, but still we're journalists first, and the news never stops. How do you mitigate it, or how have you mitigated that over the past year and a half? Elvia, or was somebody else going to speak?
I wish I could give you like, oh, this is how I did it, and now I'm super successful at like self-care. But I feel like it kind of changes week by week, day by day. But I have tried to really step away from work when I'm not on, and setting that clear boundary of like, this, I'm not on work, don't check Slack when you are not on the clock, because if you do, you're just going to go in a rabbit hole, and you're going to basically start working. It's really hard to do that because I feel like journalists feel like they have to be on 24/7, but you're human and you have to really give yourself a break. And even though you might feel like you put that shield on whenever you're reporting, it's only so thick, it's only going to protect you so much, and eventually things do get to you. So having that clear boundary, and also doing things that bring me joy, reading books. I play this little like farming video game on my time off, really connecting with my friends and talking to people about how I feel, and not just keeping that inside, because I tend to be a person who kind of suffers in silence sometimes. And I've learned throughout the past year and a half, almost 2 years, that, it's okay to speak up and talk to people and ask for help, or just tell them how you're feeling. And a lot of the times people are feeling the same way that you are. So I've definitely connected with a lot of my friends more intimately, just being open and telling them, hey, I'm tired, I'm stressed out, and then they'll tell me, yeah, me too, like I'm exhausted. So those are some of the things that I do to self-care, just and also being aware when I'm tired. Like, don't push yourself. If you feel exhausted, take a break. Don't be like a hero. Like, you're gonna be more productive if you are in a better headspace, or if you take a screen break, or if you go for a walk, or like if you take a break to actually eat lunch. So those are some of the things. But of course, like I said, it changes every day. I'm not perfect at self-care every single day, but at least I try to care for myself. Or, if I realize that I'm not doing what I need to be doing to take care of myself, I'm like, okay, take a step back. Like, what do you need to do in order to get your needs met, both like physically and mentally and emotionally, and like actually take care of yourself if you're feeling exhausted.
It's easier said than done as journalists, and again, the news cycle that we've been covering for this past time. Alex, what have you found as outlets? So you talked about the boundaries you put in place when covering George Floyd's public wake in Houston, stepping back when you need to. I think leading to more effective reporting, and again, self-care. But are there any healthy outlets you found throughout this time?
I kind of second what Elvia said. This changes on a daily to weekly basis. What I use is kind of outlets for self-care, outlets to remind myself, hey, my job is not my identity. It is not my worth. There are other things that I bring to the table, and I do not need to stress myself out to the point where I'm not eating, I'm not taking a break from my computer. Like, it is not that serious. Nothing is ever that serious. And so not because of the pandemic, but I actually did get a dog during the pandemic. So that definitely helps me with, every couple hours saying, okay, I need to take 10, 15 minutes away from the computer just to walk him, to make sure he is doing the most basic things he needs to get done. So that kind of helps me with that personal boundary of getting away from the computer. Other things that have helped is having a supportive network of friends, having group texts where I can go to them, people in journalism, people outside of journalism, where I can talk to them about, hey, this is what's happening today. I'm stressed out over this and that story, and we can kind of talk things out. But another thing I would say is, finding a hobby outside of journalism, doing something that you love and not worrying if it aligns with my job or not. I feel like every journalist needs an outlet because this work can be so draining. And so for me, that's, been dog walking or hanging out with groups of friends or like trying out new restaurants in Austin, really anything that kind of gets me away from my computer and gets me away from thinking about the news of the day. But yeah, I just think it's really important to set boundaries with yourself, but also with your managers as well. So if you feel like you've been doing too much in a week, if you work a 12-hour day on Monday, I don't see any reason why you can't ask your manager to, start working midday Tuesday or something like that. Try to figure out a balance. So it's like you're not working yourself to death. And I think that's something that's not really talked about a lot in journalism because there's such an emphasis on the grind and the hustle and, you need to work your way up to the top. And, I think that was maybe kind of the old school way of thinking, but that's not the case now. And it's not healthy for any journalist to have those expectations for themselves.
Well, to be honest, it's pretty awesome for all of us to have these perspectives, I think, this young in our careers, just because we've all had to grow up, I think, in different ways over the past year and a half. Olivia, for you, it's been watercolors, right?
Yes, I'd
In
say
part.
probably taking a big break from work, getting the mental health support that I needed, moving states, quitting my job. But, for me, I think this conversation about self-care and burnout really has to include a conversation about institutional and policy things that newsrooms can do, because I believe the Online News Association published a study last week about the difference between institutional and individual problems in this arena. And most of the causes of burnout are institutional. And I think a lot about how, there was a period during the pandemic when we would say everyone's a COVID reporter, but there are people who have been doing the beat of COVID from January 2021. Sorry, what year is it? January 2020, and nothing else. And I think it has become more normal for people who are covering COVID to say, I need a month of covering something else, or I need to take some time and switch beats to something that doesn't involve death or trauma all the time. And having newsrooms actually have ongoing conversations about this, sometimes with unions or sometimes involving a training center like the DART Center for Trauma and Journalism coming in and talking to managers about how they can be proactive about checking in, about how they can set up systems where after you cover a major death or see a dead body, for example, you have a conversation about it instead of just, I'm still burned out, but I have 20 pitches to send you tomorrow morning. That's fine. And having your feelings validated is important, but everyone needs a break. And, sometimes just your 1 week of PTO isn't going to cut it. And having, real transparent conversations about what, humans can take is something that I think journalism we're just so used to being like, yeah, I worked 12 hours yesterday and I didn't sleep at all and I wrote 5,000 words, and that's great, but there should be a conversation about how the 2 days after that, maybe that person couldn't get out of bed, because I think we love to glamorize the grind, as Alex mentioned, and that creativity really doesn't exist without rest and safety and the ability to have conversations about what you're feeling.
Well said, and you beat me to it. I was going to highlight the fact that you wrote all about this in a post that went viral after or as you were shifting positions in your career, titled "The COVID Reporters, are not okay, extremely not okay." Just talking about the institutional failures throughout this time. I know there was a lot of at our organization and other organizations that I've worked with, as partners through the Tribune, about, self-care and taking care of yourself. But then sometimes at the top, you weren't seeing that, and that wouldn't trickle down, even though you're saying it, really, you guys need to take care of yourselves. But then if those at the top aren't taking care of themselves, it sets in motion, through middle management and things like that, yeah, maybe nobody can ever really disconnect. I guess talk a little bit about that. I mean, how receptive now, again, since we're so far into this, have your organizations or, Olivia, through different publications you've worked with in your role now as a freelancer, been receptive to that?
I can go
Yeah.
first.
Okay.
So I know that at least for my team, my manager has started taking breaks, which is like a very unheard of thing because he works so much. But I think him realizing that like he has to be the example kind of has helped him. Because yeah, like if you see your manager working, you're like, oh, I want to prove that I'm also like worthy of like moving up. And if I want to be a manager one day, or if I want to be like the best, I have to work and I have to be connected all the time. So that's one way that I've seen that change. And also one other thing that the Tribune did that I really did appreciate is giving us extra PTO during the summer. So we were able to take extra PTO last summer, and it happened again this summer. So we would take Fridays off. And so you would have like a 3-day weekend. So that's something that I feel like, I don't know, people don't really talk about how like having an extra day off is like something so simple that you can do for your employees that really helps, because sometimes you just need 2 days off is not enough a week. So that's another thing that has changed within the organization. And of course, we're still going through a lot of transitions because we're going to get a new editor here soon. And we've had leadership kind of change in the past year. So we'll see like how that looks in the future. But those are some of the 2 things that I realized that have changed that I feel like have helped me personally, at least.
Alex, do you feel, though, again, voicing that you need a break or setting those boundaries, your organization has been receptive?
I think they have. I can't talk too much about, what 538 did back in March, January of 2020 when COVID first hit, just because I wasn't there. But now being a reporter there, I've noticed that my manager, if she notices that I've been working too long, she will call me out on it and be like, okay, how can we make up for this in the future? So an example of this is I went to CPAC up in Dallas a few months ago. I don't actually remember what month it was. But I was volunteering to work on a weekend. And I feel like at some jobs, they just be like, okay, you volunteered to do that. You're working on a weekend. We'll see you back in the office on Monday. My boss was very kind. She was like, okay, I noticed that you're working over the weekend. What day off do you want in this coming week? And so I, of course I picked Friday. And so I could have my little 3-day weekend. And I really appreciated that she took the time to ask me that question. Another thing that I really appreciate my boss doing is if she's trying to assign me like a lot of stories at once, I'll sit down with her and say, okay, I know you want this story, but I also have these 2 other things on my plate. What should I be prioritizing? And let's figure out like concrete deadlines that you want for each of these things, because I don't want to be in a position where I have 3 drafts and an outline due by Thursday. I feel like that's just stressful for her and myself. So I feel like just setting those boundaries of, what should we be prioritizing? What do we need to get done ASAP? What can wait until next week? That's just something that we've kind of implemented over the 6 or 7 months that I've been there, and that's been really helpful.
We've seen a lot of turnover in the news industry for different reasons, different paths that they've taken. A lot of people have turned to freelance, wanting to be their own bosses, set their own times, own days. I was just looking at an email though this morning that got sent to me about a poll of freelancers saying they're about 20% or more stressed or working more than they were before. Olivia, can you speak to any of that? I mean, has it been a good solution for you?
Yes and no. So I got phenomenal advice from other women reporters who went freelance years ago. And, one of the biggest things that I think is in common between the people who are doing it well and not feeling as burned out is that they look at their calendar a year at a time and say, you know, these are the number of stories I want to write per week. This is how much money I want to make. And this is how much time I'm going to take off. But I will say for me that it's been helpful to partly just through reporting, find out what other newsrooms are doing, what the norms are for other people. I don't think I'm a, you know, common freelance case because I've been taking so much time off and I'm working on other super long-term projects that I can't talk about yet. And, you know, things like that. But I know folks who are, you know, freelancing and waiting tables and working in libraries. So everyone's a little bit of a different case. I just think the positive things are when you're freelance, you have more control. So I have a friend who has, you know, 3 rules. I don't work with jerks, to put it politely. You know, I don't accept less than this amount of money, and I like go to the beach every morning before I start my job. And I feel like having rules for yourself that you know work for you is probably the most important thing, and that's applicable with the newsrooms as well. Of course, full-time newsroom jobs normally come with benefits, you know, like healthcare, which is great and super expensive as a freelancer, I can say now. But yeah, I think everyone kind of has to, throughout their career, figure out what works for them. I think it's very difficult to talk about what works in general when we're still living in a pandemic, because none of the things that I think work right now are probably going to make sense for me in 3 years when the pandemic is over.
Fingers crossed.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, we say pandemic over, a lot of what's stopping that from happening is misinformation infiltrating certain communities, of people not getting the vaccine that some of you have alluded to. Talk about the fight to combat misinformation. I feel like in this time of quarantine and isolation, we've all retreated to our corners or surrounded us ourselves with people who think like us and not critically thought of different things or followed science for that matter. So what sort of tools have you developed throughout this past 18 months for the good? I mean, to try and break down those barriers and not make the media evil and actually a distributor of accurate information. Alvia, you employ quite a few through the Tribune.
Yeah, so we started a coronavirus newsletter. So that's one of the things that we started. It started as a daily newsletter, and now it's just kind of as needed. So for example, if there's like something new on masks in Texas, we'll send it. So it just has to be information that people really need in order to navigate the pandemic now. We also have a texting service where people will ask us questions, and I believe every week we'll do a roundup of answers, and I believe some of our fellows help with that. And we talk about it in our Facebook group, and we've had call outs. I've helped with explainers, just explaining like exactly why the COVID vaccine is safe, you know, things like that. Because even though those are simple questions that are like no brainers for us, you know, like, of course the vaccine is safe. I've also seen, you know, even people in my own family, like be very skeptical about the vaccine, which makes sense, given like history of it, just my, like, you know, Hispanics and Black communities and their relationship with the government and just, you know, healthcare. And it hasn't been a pretty relationship in the past. And so they're right to be skeptical of things like that. So I just kind of, it's been helpful to hear my family say these things and be like, okay, this is what people are saying, or this is the misinformation that they're spreading, whether it's like on Facebook or WhatsApp or whatever. And this is what I need to do in order to answer these questions. And it was also helpful to like talk to my parents, who were also very skeptical at the very beginning of, you know, they ended up, of course, getting the vaccine, and but they got the Johnson & Johnson vaccine, and that was like a big thing for them. They're like, I don't know if I want to get this one because like there are rumors about this or that. And so ultimately, like, they did get the vaccine, but just like seeing that reflect in my own family has helped me and has helped us answer questions through the texting, through the newsletters, through the call outs, through our explainers. So those are some of the things that we've done.
As a personal experience, the fact that we've personally, lived through the winter storm, had family members pass away from the pandemic, things like that. How much do you think, Alex, this whole experience has humanized reporters and humanized media?
I think it has a lot, honestly. I think, especially with political reporting, I mentioned this before, so much of what was considered political reporting is like, oh, the governor issued this proclamation today, or this Republican lawmaker got in an argument with this Democratic lawmaker. And for a lot of political reporting, especially early in my career, I noticed that there was less of a focus on how these policy debates are impacting everyday people. But when it came to things like COVID, you had some people saying, COVID was a hoax, COVID wasn't real, whatever that. And that was impacting everyday people too. So I feel like over the course of the last 18 months, it's kind of forced journalists who maybe were hesitant to go out and talk to everyday people to really think, okay, how I think is not how, someone down the street thinks. So, maybe I need to understand this person's point of view and understand, what misinformation they're getting, how they're getting it, and how that's impacting where they are today. So I really think, if nothing else, the pandemic has kind of forced people to get outside of their normal bubbles, normal kind of like sourcing that they use, and just talk to everyday people about how they're feeling about certain things that are impacting them just as much as they're impacting us. And, to Elvia's point, I cannot stress the importance of doing things like explainers to kind of break down, questions or break down answers to like these very complicated questions about COVID and the vaccine and everything like that. We had a reporter here at 538 who had a story. It was like, if you're unsure about getting the COVID vaccine, like start here. And she had 5 or 6 things that I guess were like very common tropes about getting the vaccine. It was like, oh, like I heard the vaccine can cause infertility. Like I heard like the vaccines weren't approved by the FDA. And then she walked through every single thing. And it's like, okay, you feel this way. Here's what the science is saying. Here's what experts are saying. So doing things like that, I think, have been really important during the pandemic.
Working in TV and being a multimedia reporter for the Tribune, and all of us working from home or living at work, however you see it, depending on your boundaries in place or lack thereof. My 4-year-old and 3-year-old crashed many of my live shots. I've only got a few angry emails. The rest of the audience seemed to be receptive, knowing everybody's just trying to make it through. But I guess that's a huge plus, is it not, as far as for our industry, because then people see us as one of them almost. Olivia, would you say that?
Yeah, I'd say if you follow me on Twitter, I have a new puppy named Edith, and I worked really hard to get her out of the shot and take all her squeaky toys away. But it's a good thing that I'm also on mute whenever someone else is speaking. Yeah, I think, at some point during the pandemic, I was working from an 8x8 room in a 5-floor walk-up with, my fold-up stationary bike taking up half the room in my closet. And my roommate and I had a gag going that our kitchen was like the galley of a flight attendant has, and we'd be like, "Do you need anything when I'm going to the galley?" Like end of pandemic maybe. And I think that has made relationships at home harder. One thing we did was when I had a roommate was get these little signs that said "on deadline" or "please come in." And that way, if I'm on a call with someone whose family member died, my roommate's not going to knock on my door and be like, "Hey, can I get you a cup of coffee?" Because, those things are difficult when you're working at home. But, for me, moving to a place where I could have a yard fully changed the way I experienced the pandemic. And I know that is a huge privilege, much like the time I took off. But it really did change everything for me to have space outdoors. At some point in New York, I was not able to, go eat at restaurants. But, if you live in the South, there was a huge chunk of the pandemic where you could eat outside or go on a picnic 6 feet away from your friends. You can't really do that in January in New York City. So I think there's, just keeping in mind that there's a huge difference for everybody who's working from home based on where they're working. But I would say I really appreciate that the remote work enabled this flexibility that I didn't get to see before in my job.
On that note, it's a massive transition this whole time, and massive transitions, we kind of step back and look what we want to hold on to, what we want to maybe let go of. What are some of those things for each of you? Elvia?
I definitely want to continue cooking more because, I have an odd schedule. I go in kind of in the middle of the day, and I usually leave, or now I guess technically log off work around sometime between 8:30 and 10 p.m. But being able to work from home, I've been able to actually cook lunch or dinner or meal prep if I don't have time to actually cook on the spot. And that's something that's changed from before, when I kind of just like went out and got whatever I could get for lunch and then kind of ate it really fast, or ate it at my desk while I was still working. And now that I am actually working from home, I take my computer and I put it away, and I like actually sit down and take time to eat. So that's a habit that I want to continue working on. And of course, like I mentioned before, I want to continue working on those boundaries of like, I'm logged off, I'm off, I'm not at work right now. And even if I am on Twitter, I'm not talking about work. I'm not going to talk about like Texas politics. We're not going to think about it. Or just completely like not looking at news when I'm on, at home during my like off time. So those are two of my big ones that I'm going to continue doing from now on.
What about anything you want to shed or don't want to go back to?
Oh God, I have a list of things that like I don't want to go back to. I think maybe just probably, that's a good one. Eating out too much, again, that's one thing that I used to do a lot. And not taking time to like actually take PTO. I felt like before the pandemic, I felt like I would save my PTO toward the end of the year sometimes, or like, for Christmas or whatever. And I'm like, now I'm using it because I'm like, I need this time off like in a random day in August just because I need it off. Like I need a mental health day. It's something I think that's something, the mentality that I want to shed, that I have slowly been able to shed, of like, if I need to take time off, it's okay, take time off, take a mental health day off. And that's something that I wasn't doing before.
Going offline, a lot of people now are saying they're deleting apps because otherwise, like Slack and things like that, because otherwise they're just too tempted that they'll get back in and, like you said, go down a rabbit hole. What about for you, Alex? Anything that you really want to embrace aside from your new dog going forward?
I would say this idea of working where you feel supported as opposed to working in an office. I mean, I felt this way even before the pandemic, but so much of journalism does not need to be done in, the walls of an office. I was talking to Ross Ramsey, the executive editor of the Tribune, a couple of weeks ago, and I was, telling him, I miss the camaraderie of the office. I miss the occasional just, walking into his office, talking with him about stories, talking with reporters who are, doing similar beats to what I have. I miss that, but at the same time, like I miss the peace and silence that comes with working remotely. If I want to drive 3 hours to Dallas to see my mom, I can do that. If I want to go on vacation in Chicago and I have my laptop on me, I can do that as well. I like the idea of having that flexibility. And I feel like so much of that is kind of taken when you're forced to be in an office, and there's really not a clear understanding of why people are forced to be in the office. I'm sure everyone here saw it, but there was an op-ed written a couple months ago, basically talking about how like people need to be in the office, and if you're not working in an office, how that could, okay, maybe you guys didn't see it. Anyway, but something that they mentioned was that there's this idea of office culture. And so much of that is like, if it's someone's birthday, you get them a cake, we all, you empty the dishwasher together, like those types of things. And like that type of like extra labor often falls on like women and people of color anyway. So it's like, what am I missing by going back to an office, just adding these additional responsibilities that are not part of my job, not why I was hired? Like, I feel like sometimes office culture can be toxic as well. And I appreciate the ability to just work where I feel supported and where I feel like I can do my work, in the best way possible.
And if anything, this time has allowed people to kind of individually approach that, right? I mean, some of our coworkers are in the office now because the Tribune started going back this past summer in limited numbers. They're very limited, especially with the spread of the Delta variant, but some people just need to be back in the office. They don't like working from home despite, or whatever their circumstances are. All this said, and it's a lot that we've covered, thankfully, with aspiring journalists and those who are studying journalism, I'll end with us kind of going around and offering advice. Or what sort of nugget of advice would you have for people considering this career during this time? Olivia?
I think when I was reporting my story for Study Hall, Study Hall is a newsletter and section for resources, and they have a Slack group for freelance writers. I highly recommend joining a newsletter or a listserv like that, because sometimes the way that people will ask questions to a group asking for advice or asking for where they should pitch something, the responses are a lot like standing near a water cooler in a newsroom, and you get a lot of advice and you get to see how many other people are willing to ask those same questions. I would say the same thing I was invited to a health reporters support group on Slack, and that has been just a sense of solidarity, understanding that most journalists will take time to have coffee with you or answer questions with you. I think it's been really wonderful to me to see the sense of solidarity and support, in particular among women journalists who've reached out to one another and supported one another. I've had people, when I quit my job, I had people offer to do, consultations with me over Zoom, and we had coffee, but lots of people do those for money. And there are so many people who have self-published books or written stories about, guidelines for, best practices for pitching, that kind of thing. There is so much information available. And, if you want to be a reporter, probably the best advice you can get is just ask questions of the people you want to hear the answers from. And that applies for advice too.
So thank you. Alex?
I have a couple like nuggets of advice I would give to people who are just now thinking about entering the industry, or they're newly grads or whatever. I guess I would say, success doesn't mean working at the biggest paper. It can mean just being at a place that aligns with your values, that gives you those mental health days, working where you feel supported. So that would be one thing. My second thing is to advocate yourself and to have allies inside and outside of the newsroom. And kind of building off of that is to keep a running list of your accomplishments, no matter how big or small, throughout the year. So you can use that as leverage for when, you do want to change beats, you want a promotion, whatever that may be. I think we get to the end of the year and have to scramble through those reviews, and it's hard to figure out like, what did I actually do in 2020? If someone asked me that, I would have no idea. So just kind of thinking about that, throughout the year. And then the last thing I'd say is that it's okay if you don't want to be an editor or a manager or a leader. I've said this before, but your worth is not tied to your title. It's not tied to your ranking. It's all about the quality of the work that you're putting out. And if you feel like you're putting out good work, then you are doing a great job.
What's that also? And Elvia, we will end with you.
Sure. I just kind of want to echo what Olivia and Alex have said. just having a support network, or just a network of people who will support you. And you can create that by like approaching people, approaching journalists in the field, and having a conversation with them through the DMs. Like I've had a lot of students approach me through DMs, and we've had Zoom chats, you know, at like people will talk to you. Another thing is advocate for yourself, and like look out for yourself. I feel like sometimes people, and I used to do this too when I was younger, like I would just be like, I'm gonna take this job because it's there, it's available. But it wasn't like the best job. The culture was bad. The benefits were not worth it. So like, take care of yourself and looking out for those things, like advocate for yourself. Make sure that you are getting your worth out of your career, because ultimately it's up to you to get what you need to get out of your career. And you deserve to pursue what you want to pursue simply because you are alive and you're a person living on this earth. And another thing is, my friend actually told me this yesterday, because I was like talking to him and having like an existential crisis that I have like once a week. But he was just kind of like, you know, I was talking about like, I want to be successful, I want to do this and that. And he's kind of like, success is very, it's an individual thing. Like you don't compare yourself to other people. Sometimes success for you is having a job that you love or being supported. It doesn't necessarily mean, kind of like what Alex said, being the top editor, or, you know, being the biggest, or the, you know, at the biggest publication, you know. So keeping that in mind, that success is subjective, and as long as you are successful and you're getting what you want out of your career, that's success.
Absolutely. And finding new ways to challenge yourself and grow. It doesn't always necessarily come with a promotion or a new title, but if you're growing in your career, then you know, and again, it's self-satisfaction and feeling good about what you're doing, because we spend a lot of time working. You need to feel, you know, happy and pleased with where you're spending the bulk of your time. With that, I will thank each of you, Olivia Messer, Alex Samuels, and Elvia Limon, for your discussion. A really insightful time, and it was nice to reflect on the past 18 months with fellow journalists. Thank you very much.